and welcome back to The Way of the Wandering Wizard. I am Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy, and I am a pure and open channel for the very finest vibrations of divine love and light, made manifest here in service to Gaia and those who travel with her, although most folks just call me Bob the Wizard. Well, in this little chapter, following on from my into the light, out of body experience as a result of being hit by a car some 9.5 years ago now. As my previous tales will tell, my valiant fight on the road for 45 minutes. I had a profound out-of-body experience, and as you can imagine, coming back into a body from that kind of state, I arrived back in a Zen-like state of complete oneness with the universe, feeling no pain. While I lay there on the road, conversing politely with my paramedic as to the depths of the universe and how it works. Believe that, you believe anything. Although the profound as that experience that I shared was, it was very much something that was there. But I defy anybody to be focusing on something like that when you're in a body that's just been hit by a car. Pretty much back on the road, back in the room, and according to the fire crew, who I had the joy to meet a few years post-accident to say thank you for all they did for me, I'd started to give my paramedic a bit of a hard time. He had arrived on the scene, ready to patch me up, and far from a responsive patient, what he actually got was a rather irate returning Bob the Wizard, who apparently gave him a bit of a lecture on the fact that the golden hour did include being picked up from a road and delivered to a hospital, not a golden hour before they even arrived, although he was there in 44-ish minutes. It's natural as my body started to recover, as it got a line into me, fluid started to go on board, the painkillers started to kick in, took the edge off of that pain that had just quite literally driven me from my body. Like most people in shock, I probably got a little bit more responsive. Apparently I got a little bit vocal. As I said, I definitely was not the ideal patient. I more than politely informed him exactly what my injuries were, what he should be doing with them, and the fact that he ought to be putting my knee back into its socket because it was floating around in my bottom at the time. Quite rightly, like all sensible professionals, having been confronted with this before, was basically asking me to shut up and let him get on with his job, and that he wouldn't put my hip back into its joint because it would do a lot more damage than had already been done. It was still that intense pain as the things were moving down in my hip. Well, consummate professional that he was, lines in, more pain relief on board, and I started to sort of calm down slightly. And he looked at me and we had a wonderful little conversation, something along the lines of, have you ever tried ketamine before? It's like, yeah, once, a long time ago. Did you have any adverse reactions? Yeah. I went there expecting to be dancing my little socks off, and I ended up slumped down the wall with my legs not working, feeling like somebody gave me a horse tranquilizer. So I was a little bit piddled off, but no adverse physical effect, or words to that effect. Well, ketamine duly administered, and then I did start to float a little bit. And as he pointed out to me, he was going to have to move my hip to put me into a scoop to lift me off the road. Now, with a free-floating head of a femur drifting around in my bottom, attached to bits of my sciatic nerve, the experience, even on ketamine, was not a pleasant one. But strangely, once the scoop was in and the hips were bolted back together again, it was a lot more comfortable. I can remember vaguely as he worked on my leg, it had literally swollen up. It looked like an elephant's leg. But it was splinted. I was patched, wrapped up, having cut all my clothes off, which I believe we did have a little bit of an argument about him cutting off my leather jacket. But as he said, in shock, and as I knew, people might miss other injuries, and he had to check me over. With an injury like that, of course, he was concerned about my C-spine and damage as I'd flown through the air, whiplash and damage to my spinal cord. So I was quite neatly trussed up, great big collar round my neck, and laying there, still on the road, wrapped up and ready to travel, more than a distinctly drifty. It took a while. I'll be honest, my bike had left the road before I did. An ambulance crew, obviously as a first responder, he couldn't take me in the back of his car as much as I'd asked him to. So he did the logical thing, called in another crew, and I was eventually picked up and placed into the back of an ambulance. It was still an intensely painful experience, and I was very much not out of the woods. I have a vague memory of looking up at the ambulanceman while he politely informed me that what he was about to give me was some paracetamol. I think the shock and disbelief may have registered on my face. It certainly came out of my mouth something along the lines of, seriously, I've just been hit by a fucking car. You think a couple of paracetamol's going to help? Well, this is intravenous paracetamol. It was an altogether different beast. And shortly after, having told me that I would thank him for what he was about to do, I did thank him for what he was about to do. As that drifted in, the relief was immense. And for the first time in an hour, I was starting to get somewhere close to being back in my body again. Needless to say, the roads in this area are no better than the roads in your area, and I felt every single bump. In fact, I think I may have actually commented to the poor bloke, are you actually aiming for every pothole? And close to some 2 hours later, I arrived in the hospital, actually, back in the hospital, strangely. And being a local boy, I arrived in the hospital that I was born in. Well, a very new and modern version of it. The old one had been knocked down, and the hospital I was being delivered to was brand spanking new. Now, by divine coincidence, soul planning, luck, just so happened that as I was delivered to A&E, one of the members of staff that was on duty was my actual birth brother. Now, given an accident-prone life and the extreme way that I live, having a brother that works in hospital has been incredibly useful to me over the years, as I will share as I expand on my story in later chapters. But for now, having been wheeled in, crashed through the corridors, to see a familiar face, a warm hand on the shoulder, was probably a lifesaver. Michael had been already, my brother, ready to receive an RTA. He had no idea who it was, and it was only literally minutes before I was wheeled in that his boss informed him that it was actually me. And obviously he was stood down from duties. Well, arriving in hospital, having lost a lot of blood, having been in a lot of pain, having had a rather intense and mind-altering, world-changing, out-of-body experience, but still very focused on staying alive. It was pretty drifty in there, as you can imagine. By then I'd had all kinds of, I'd had a lot of morphine, I'd had a lot of ketamine, I'd had a lot of paracetamol. Pain was still there, and various other pain relief was administered, and I was pretty drifty. Then I had the greatest joy of all, being informed that I'd have to be put through the MRI scanner. They needed to understand the full extent of my injuries. Unfortunately, as I'd been on the road, I was in a metal scoop, and as you can imagine, introducing a large metal stretcher into a powerful NMR magnet might not have been the most healthy thing to do, so they had to take me off and put me on a plastic one. The pain as my hip literally flopped back open was intense, even with the pain relief. But then back in the scoop, and I had a very trippy experience of being wheeled, put on a trolley, And as the trolley takes you in and out of the spinny magnetic machine, the flashing lights were just immense. So at that point in my journey, I was a little drifty. I have vague memories of being taken back into A&E after my scan. I think there was a neurological assessment at some point. Vague memories of a neurologist basically looking at the list of things that I was on and were like, well, how do you expect me to ascertain what's gone on with somebody that's effectively a anaesthetised patient? Apparently, given my capacity to deal with drugs, I turned around to him and said, well, you can always ask me, mate, or words to that effect. Well, the assessments were done and the scan confirmed pretty much what I thought had happened. My foot was an absolute jigsaw puzzle. I had a huge break in my tib and fib. It exploded out all over the place, the open fracture. And the head of my femur had quite literally pulled out of a neat little ring at the bottom of our pelvis called the acetabulum, as I was to be soon informed, and had basically torn it straight out the bottom of that, and that was where the pain was. They were an extensive set of injuries, but they were pretty much focused on one leg. I had no internal injuries. My neck was sound. Head was as sane and sound as it always is. And so the collar came off, and I was prepared for the first of my operations. Now, memories of being wheeled in with Michael, a long and interesting conversation with my anaesthetist. An awesome guy. And as we discussed, Michael helped fill in my history. He was aware of the fact that, I've tried a few drugs in my time. It's important for me to say now, I was an experimenter. I had no real addiction issues apart from nicotine. I enjoyed a beer, but it was never too much. All right, pretty full on at times, but it never took over my life as such. I'd certainly had my fair share of recreationals over the years. But for the most part, they were great times. No great issues with them. I was now a dad. Those were all things in the past. Obviously, I had a degree of a tolerance or an experience of these things. I'd been through an awful lot of other accidents, which I'll share later. Letting go of a body that you've fought very hard for two and a bit hours to stay in, and every time I'd close my eyes, somebody had shaken me by the shoulder or rattled me about. I found it quite hard to let go, until eventually, whatever the anaesthetic was kicked in. And thankfully, at that point, everything went blank. I had no out-of-body recollection of my accidents. I probably watched them. I'm not sure that I wanted to. But at some level I would have observed them. But I certainly don't have any conscious recollection of them, unlike the road. I woke whatever it was, 3 or 4 hours later after the operation. Through recovery, very drifty, and into my room, where I was to stay for a little while. And that will be the next little chapter of my journey. Recovering in hospital. As always, folks, thanks for listening to these little video snippets. There is a purpose for me personally by sharing my story. I'm sharing with you a process that's taken some 9 years of revisiting my accident, of all that it's brought up for me, of the emotions, the lessons. As with all humans, telling stories about ourselves, retelling our tale to others, helps us gain context of our lives. So, if you've watched this, thank you for your service to me. It helps to be listened to, even when you're an old wise wizard like myself. So, I look forward to meeting you, those of you who are following the journey again, in accident recovery, or my 21 days in a hospital. Thanks for listening.